I was halfway through my homemade steak and potatoes when I heard it, the deafening roar of a chainsaw ripping through metal. For a second I thought I was imagining it. Who in their right mind would be cutting metal in the middle of a quiet afternoon? But as the sound intensified, a sinking feeling hit my gut. I dropped my fork, rushed to the front porch and froze. Karen, my next-door nightmare, was standing there, revving a chainsaw like she was auditioning for a horror movie, slicing through my farm gate as if it were a cheap wooden fence. Sparks flew as the metal groaned, splitting apart. My stomach twisted in disbelief. Was this real life? I charged toward her, my boots kicking up dust, my heart pounding with a mixture of shock and fury. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I shouted. Karen didn't even flinch. With the most casual expression, she lifted her designer sunglasses and smirked at me like I was the one causing a scene. "Oh hey Jack. Yeah, I needed a new driveway and your gate was kinda in the way." I blinked, trying to process the sheer audacity. My gate?" I repeated, voice rising. "Karen, that's my property. You can't just chop it down." She sighed dramatically like I was a child throwing a tantrum over nothing. "Oh come on. You have so much land, Jack. It's not like you need this tiny little entrance. My guests need a proper place to park and this just made sense." I looked past her and saw what she had done. My farm entrance was now nothing more than a sad pile of sawed-off metal, and beyond that she had already started paving over the dirt, expanding her so-called driveway straight through my property like she owned the place. A few workers in orange vests were standing around, clearly uncomfortable as they shoveled gravel onto my land. I clenched my fists. "Karen, move your damn car. Fix my gate. And get off my land." She laughed, like I had just told the funniest joke in the world. "Jack, don't be so dramatic. It's not a big deal. I'll even let you use my new driveway if you're nice about it." I stared at her, completely at a loss for words. This woman had actually convinced herself that she was being generous by offering me access to my own stolen land. Before I could say another word, she waved a hand dismissively. "Look, I don't have time for a debate. I've got people coming over later and I need this done by tonight. Just relax, have a drink or something." I took a deep breath, fighting the urge to lose my mind right then and there. I wasn't about to start a screaming match with a woman who clearly lived in her own entitled fantasy world. No, I had a better idea. I turned on my heel and walked away. Let her think she won. Let her believe she had just steamrolled me without consequence. Because I was about to make sure this would be the worst mistake of her life. That evening I sat on my porch watching as Karen joyfully directed her workers, telling them exactly where she wanted things, adjusting the placement of her ridiculous plastic private driveway sign, and even having the nerve to park her brand new car right where my gate used to be. She looked proud, smug even, like she had conquered some great inconvenience in her life. I took another sip of my iced tea and smiled. She had no idea what was coming. But first I had to play it smart. I needed to gather some information. I spent the next day making calls, looking up property records and checking zoning laws. And let me tell you, it didn't take long to find some very interesting details. For starters, Karen wasn't just guilty of trespassing. She had illegally modified land that wasn't hers. And to top it off, she hadn't even filed for proper permits for the construction she was doing. That was all I needed. I headed down to City Hall and had a chat with a very helpful officer in the zoning department. The moment I explained what had happened, their eyes widened. Turns out, Karen was already on their radar for previous complaints from other neighbors. It was almost too easy. That evening, just as Karen was celebrating her new driveway with a few of her equally entitled friends, a city inspector rolled up in his official vehicle. I watched from my porch as he stepped out, clipboard in hand, and approached Karen with a stern expression. Karen, oblivious to her impending doom, greeted him with her usual fake smile. "Oh, hello. Can I help you?" The inspector barely acknowledged her fake charm. "Ma'am, we've received reports of unauthorized construction on private property. We need to conduct an inspection immediately." Karen's smile twitched. "Oh, there must be a misunderstanding. This is my driveway." The inspector glanced down at his notes. "According to property records, this area belongs to Mr. Jack." He nodded toward me. I gave Karen a small wave from my porch. Her face drained of color. Yes, but it was an agreement. Jack doesn't mind, do you, Jack?" I took a leisurely sip of my drink before answering. Oh, I definitely mind. The inspector's expression didn't change. Ma'am, not only have you trespassed on private property, but you've also violated multiple zoning regulations. You'll need to remove all unauthorized structures immediately or face fines of up to $50,000. Karen's jaw dropped. $50,000. That's insane. This is just a simple driveway. The inspector remained unfazed. The law is the law, ma'am. You have 3 days to comply. I thought Karen's tantrum from earlier was bad, but this was a new level of entertainment. She stomped, screamed, and even tried to play the victim card. I'm a single woman. This is harassment. He just wants to ruin my life. The inspector didn't care. He simply handed her a written notice and left. Karen turned to me, eyes blazing. You did this. You reported me, didn't you? I leaned back in my chair, stretching lazily. Karen, you brought this on yourself. You can't just take things that aren't yours and expect no consequences. She pointed a shaking finger at me. You haven't won yet, Jack. I grinned. Oh, I know. I'm just getting started. As she stormed back to her house, I chuckled to myself. She had no idea that this was only the beginning of her very, very bad week. Karen was livid. After the city inspector had handed her the notice, she spent the next 2 days stomping around like an angry toddler, ranting to anyone who would listen about how unfair and cruel I was. Apparently, I was a heartless villain who took pleasure in making her life miserable. I, on the other hand, was thoroughly enjoying watching karma do its job. But I wasn't done yet. No, Karen had taken my land, destroyed my property, and laughed in my face about it. She thought she could get away with it. She thought she could bulldoze over me just like she bulldozed my gate. She had another thing coming. I made my way back to City Hall, this time with a new purpose. I had already gotten her fined and her driveway marked for removal, but I wanted to see just how deep of a hole she had dug for herself. And sure enough, a quick chat with the zoning office confirmed that Karen had violated more than just a few small property laws. She had unknowingly built her illegal driveway over a section of land that was designated as a protected drainage area. That meant she wasn't just trespassing on my property, she was interfering with city infrastructure. That was a whole different level of violation, one that the city took very, very seriously. I didn't even have to file another complaint. The moment I pointed it out, the officials practically jumped at the chance to investigate further. They scheduled a follow-up inspection for the next morning, which meant Karen was in for another unpleasant surprise. I almost felt bad for her. Almost. But then I remembered the sound of my gate being torn apart under her chainsaw, the smug look on her face as she paved over my land, and suddenly, all sympathy disappeared. By the time the city officials arrived the next day, Karen was already in full meltdown mode. I stood on my porch, sipping my coffee as she frantically tried to argue with the inspectors, but they weren't having it. The lead inspector, a no-nonsense man in his 50s, informed her that not only would she have to remove the driveway, but she would also be responsible for restoring the drainage area she had damaged. The cost? Easily over $20,000. Karen's face turned a shade of red I didn't even know was possible. She spun around to glare at me, her fists clenched at her sides. "This is your fault," she shrieked, her voice cracking. "You set me up. You planned this." I tilted my head, pretending to think. "Karen, remind me again, who was it that brought a chainsaw onto my property?" Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she wasn't giving up just yet. That was the thing about people like Karen. Even when faced with overwhelming evidence of their own wrongdoing, they refused to take responsibility. Instead, they doubled down. And that was exactly what she did next. That afternoon, as I was tending to my farm, I saw Karen marching toward me with a stack of papers in her hand. She slammed them down onto my fence post like she was delivering some sort of divine judgment. "I spoke to a lawyer," she declared, her voice dripping with smugness. "And I have every right to sue you for harassment. You've been targeting me, reporting me out of spite, and making my life unbearable. So unless you want a lawsuit, I suggest you drop this ridiculous campaign against me and let me keep the driveway." I stared at her for a moment, then at the papers. They weren't actual lawsuit documents. They were a mix of random legal jargon she had probably printed from the internet. My lips twitched. She had officially lost it. "Karen," I said slowly, "you do realize that you're the one who committed trespassing, property damage, and illegal construction, right?" Her eyes darted to the side for a second before she squared her shoulders. None of that matters. I have a right to defend myself against neighbor harassment. I couldn't help it. I laughed. A full, belly-deep laugh that made her face twist in fury. Karen, go ahead and sue me, I said, wiping a tear from my eye. Please. I would love to see you explain to a judge why you think cutting down my gate and stealing my land was perfectly fine, but me calling the authorities on you is harassment. Her confidence wavered for just a moment. Then she huffed and crossed her arms. Fine. If you want to play dirty, I can play dirty too. And with that she stormed off. I had no idea what she meant by that, but I didn't have to wait long to find out. The next morning I woke up to find my farm's entrance completely blocked off. Not just with her car but with several cars strategically parked in a way that made it impossible for me to drive in or out. I blinked in disbelief, rubbing my temples as I tried to process the sheer level of pettiness. I grabbed my phone, called the non-emergency police line and calmly explained the situation. It wasn't long before an officer showed up. Karen, of course, tried to spin her usual nonsense. I'm just having a small gathering with friends. We have nowhere else to park and Jack has so much land. Why is he being so selfish? The officer wasn't amused. Ma'am, you're blocking private property and access to a working farm. Move the vehicles now or they will be towed. Karen's friends, who up until that point had been snickering and whispering amongst themselves, suddenly weren't so amused anymore. They scrambled to move their cars as Karen gritted her teeth, glaring at me like I had personally ruined her life. I just smiled and waved. The thing about Karen was that she didn't understand when to quit. Most people, after being fined thousands of dollars, after being forced to remove their illegal driveway, and after being repeatedly caught in their own mess, would have taken the loss and moved on. Not Karen. Karen still thought she could win. But I had one final move left. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I made a phone call. Not to the police, not to the city, but to someone Karen would never expect. Her ex-husband. Through a mutual acquaintance, I had learned that Karen's ex had been looking to buy property nearby, and well, I just so happened to have a little piece of land that I was willing to sell. Not much, just enough space for a new neighbor to settle in. The next morning, as Karen was dealing with the latest city fine she had received, she watched in horror as a moving truck pulled into the small plot of land right next to her house. And when her ex stepped out of the car, greeting me with a friendly handshake, I thought she was going to pass out right then and there. I didn't even need to say anything. The look of pure defeat on her face was the most satisfying thing I had ever seen. Karen had spent weeks trying to take what wasn't hers. She had tried to bully, manipulate, and scheme her way to getting what she wanted. But in the end, all she had done was dig her own grave. And I had made sure she fell right into it. Karen's scream of pure frustration was music to my ears. She stood frozen on her so-called driveway, clutching her head like her worst nightmare had just materialized right in front of her. And in a way, it had. Her ex-husband, a tall man with an easygoing grin, stepped out of his car and stretched his arms as if he had just arrived at a five-star resort. I watched with barely contained amusement as Karen's face twisted in a mix of disbelief, fury, and sheer horror. She stomped toward me, her heels clicking aggressively against the pavement she had so arrogantly claimed just days ago. "You did this on purpose," she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You sold land to my ex just to ruin my life." I took my time sipping my coffee before answering. "Karen, I was just looking to sell a little extra land. Turns out he was looking for a place nearby. Coincidence, huh?" Her ex-husband, Mark, chuckled as he walked up beside me. "Actually, I've been looking for a peaceful place to settle down, and when Jack mentioned he had land for sale, I jumped at the opportunity." Small world. Karen's eyes twitched violently. "This is harassment," she screamed. "I'm going to sue both of you." Mark sighed, shaking his head. "Karen, I didn't move in to start a war with you. But let's be honest, you've been pulling the same stunts since the day we got married. Taking what's not yours, making up rules as you go, acting like you're above everyone else. It's about time you faced some consequences." Karen let out an incoherent scream of frustration before spinning on her heel and storming back into her house, slamming the door so hard the windows shook. Mark chuckled, shaking his head. "That went well." I grinned. "Better than I expected." Over the next few days, Karen's situation unraveled even further. First, the construction crew she had hired to pave over my land had to come back, not to finish the job but to tear it all up. Per the city's orders, her illegal driveway had to be removed entirely, and the original layout of the land had to be restored. Watching her precious pavement get ripped apart chunk by chunk was oddly satisfying. But it got better. Since she had destroyed my gate and altered my property without permission, the city not only made her pay for the removal, but they also slapped her with a massive restoration fee. She had to cover the costs of reinstalling a new gate for me, plus the labor fees for fixing the damage she had done to the land. Karen, of course, tried to fight it. She filed complaints, tried to play the victim, and even went on social media ranting about how she was being harassed by an evil neighbor and a corrupt city government. Unfortunately for her, no one was buying it. By now, the entire neighborhood was on my side. Word had spread quickly about what she had done, and people were sick of her antics. At one point, she even tried to start a petition to stop Jack from bullying homeowners. A grand total of 2 people signed it. One of them was Karen. Then came the final blow. I hadn't planned this part, but it was almost poetic how perfectly it all came together. You see, in the middle of all her chaos, Karen had completely forgotten to pay her HOA fees for the last several months. Normally, an overdue payment wouldn't be a big deal, but since she had already racked up so many violations for things like unauthorized construction and public disturbances, her missed payments were the last straw. The HOA sent her a final warning: pay the fees and the fines or face foreclosure proceedings. I had never seen Karen so quiet before. For the first time, she wasn't screaming, threatening, or making a scene. She was just standing there on her now destroyed driveway, looking at the letter in her hands like it was a death sentence. And in a way it was. She tried to sell her house, but thanks to her reputation and the hefty fines attached to it, no one was interested. Even if she could find a buyer, she wouldn't make nearly enough to cover the damage she had done. She was officially trapped in a mess of her own making. The final conversation I had with her was surprisingly short. She came to my porch one evening looking disheveled and desperate. "Jack," she started, forcing a tight-lipped smile, "I think we got off on the wrong foot. Maybe we can come to some sort of arrangement." I leaned back in my chair, giving her a curious look. "An arrangement?" She nodded quickly. "Yes. Maybe we can forget all this. I'll even pay for half of a new gate. We don't need to involve the HOA, the city, or—" I stopped her with a raised hand. "Karen, you made it clear from the start that you don't care about rules or fairness. You took my property, destroyed my gate, and acted like you were doing me a favor. Now that it's all backfiring, you want to make a deal?" Her fake smile faltered. "I don't think so," I interrupted. "The city's handling the legal side. The HOA is handling the fines. As far as I'm concerned, you're just facing the consequences of your own actions." She stared at me for a long moment, as if trying to find some last-minute excuse, some way to manipulate the situation back in her favor. But there was nothing left for her to use. No leverage, no tricks, no fake legal threats. She had lost. Without another word, she turned and walked away. A month later, the for sale sign went up. She finally managed to sell the house at a massive loss just to escape the debt she had racked up. By the time she left, she had become a neighborhood joke. A cautionary tale about what happens when entitlement meets reality. And as for me, well, I got my new gate stronger than ever. I had my land back, along with a newfound respect from my neighbors, who all agreed that watching Karen self-destruct was one of the most entertaining things they had ever witnessed. Mark, Karen's ex, stayed in his new home, and we actually became good friends. Every now and then we'd sit on my porch, crack open a couple of beers, and reminisce about the great driveway disaster of the year. And as for Karen, no one really knows where she went. Rumor has it she tried to pull similar stunts in a different neighborhood, but after the fiasco here, her reputation followed her. If she had just left things alone, if she had just apologized and fixed her mistake, she could have walked away with nothing more than a warning. But she didn't. She doubled down, tried to cheat the system, and in the end she lost everything. It was poetic justice at its finest. And honestly, I couldn't have scripted it better myself.